At 58 years old, Ruth Macklin walked out of a courthouse with a cardboard box, $200, and the deed to a gas station she hadn't visited in over a decade. Her ex-husband kept the house, the savings, and the woman he'd been sleeping with for 6 years. But what Ruth found hidden behind the walls of that gas station would change everything. Not just for her, but for an entire valley that had been waiting for someone to come home. If stories like this move you, take a moment and subscribe, because what happens in this one still stays with me. The courtroom smelled like floor polish and recycled air. Late morning light came through tall windows and landed on nothing in particular. Just the scuffed tile and the wooden chairs and the long table where Ruth sat alone on one side with her hands folded in her lap. She wore a gray cardigan she'd bought at a thrift store 3 weeks earlier, because her good coats were still in the closet of the house on Briar Creek, and she hadn't been allowed back inside to collect them. Dennis wasn't there. He'd sent his attorney, a man named Felton Charcoal Suit Silver Cufflinks, who sat across the table reviewing documents with the relaxed posture of someone billing $400 an hour to be bored. He checked his watch twice before the judge even entered. The judge read the settlement terms into a microphone that buzzed on every third word. Ruth listened. She didn't interrupt. She had stopped interrupting years ago, maybe decades ago, so gradually she couldn't have told you when it happened. It was like a faucet you turn down a little at a time until one morning you realize there's no water at all, and you can't remember the last time there was. 4 signatures, 2 initials, 33 years of marriage reduced to a stack of documents in a manila folder. Felton slid a single sheet across the table without looking at her. This is the asset schedule. The Briar Creek Property Vehicles Retirement Accounts and Investment Portfolio remain with Mr. Macklin. You retain the Ford pickup personal effects and the real property at Route 11, Goshen County. The real property. That was the phrase they used for her father's gas station. A cinder block building on a mountain road she could barely find on a map anymore. A place she hadn't set foot in since Earl's funeral 12 years ago. Dennis's lawyers had appraised it at $14,000 and surrendered it without argument. A rounding error on his spreadsheet. A gesture designed to look generous in front of a judge. Ruth picked up the cardboard box from beneath the table. It was a medium moving box, the kind you buy at a hardware store, and inside were the items Dennis had left on the kitchen counter for her to collect. A jewelry box that had been her mother's, the velvet lining worn smooth at the corners. A photo album from Connie's childhood. The pages stiff, some of the pictures loose. A coffee mug that read, "World's Best Mom," with a chip on the rim where someone had knocked it against the faucet years ago and no one had bothered to throw it away. 33 years. One box. She carried it across the parking lot. The asphalt was warm under the September sun, and the light was sharp and ordinary. The kind of light that doesn't care what just happened to you. She set the box in the bed of the truck. The Ford was a 2006 Model White with 160,000 miles on the odometer and a cracked dashboard that caught the heat all summer. The passenger door stuck if you didn't lift the handle at exactly the right angle. Dennis had bought it 8 years ago for a landscaper who quit after 2 weeks, and it sat in the driveway collecting pollen until Ruth started using it for errands. When the settlement came through, Dennis told Felton she could keep it. Ruth could picture the conversation. Let her have the truck. It's not worth the argument. She sat behind the wheel for a long time. The key was in the ignition, but she didn't turn it. She looked at the courthouse, at the glass doors she'd just walked through at the parking lot, where Felton's black sedan was already pulling away. She had nowhere to go. That was the simple truth of it. The house on Briar Creek was Dennis's now officially, though it had stopped being hers long before the papers were signed. She had no apartment, no job, no friends who weren't really Dennis's friends. The couples they'd had dinner with for years who had quietly stopped calling her back once the separation became public. $211 in a checking account that would soon carry only her name. She pulled the deed from the folder on the passenger seat. The paper was old, creased from years in a filing cabinet at the county clerk's office. Macklin Gas and Service Route 11, Goshen County. Deeded to Ruth Ann Macklin per the last will and testament of Earl Robert Macklin, deceased. Her father had left it to her when he died. She'd driven down for the funeral, spent 3 days sorting through his things, locked the door, and never come back. Dennis said the property wasn't worth the taxes. Ruth hadn't argued. She never argued with Dennis about money or decisions or the slow erasure of everything she used to be. That was the arrangement. Nobody ever said it out loud, but they both understood it perfectly, the way you understand the walls of a room you've lived in so long, you've forgotten they're there. She turned the key. The engine caught on the third try, coughing once before settling into a rough idle that vibrated through the steering column. She pulled out of the lot and pointed the truck south. The drive took 4 hours. Interstate gave way to two-lane highway. Two-lane highway gave way to county road. County road gave way to Route 11, a cracked ribbon of asphalt that climbed into the Blue Ridge Mountains through tunnels of oak and hickory and the occasional burst of white pine. The trees were beginning to turn. Edges of copper and gold bled through the green canopy, and the shadows on the road shifted with every curve. Ruth rolled the window down. The air changed the higher she climbed. Cooler, thinner, carrying the smell of damp leaves and wood smoke, and underneath it something she hadn't smelled in decades. The ancient mineral scent of mountain rock, of soil that had been soiled since before anything human happened on top of it. She remembered this road, summers as a girl. Her mother would drop her at the station in June and pick her up in August. 2 months with Earl learning to pump gas, make change, check oil. He taught her to read a tire tread the way other fathers taught their daughters to read music. She could change a fan belt by 12. Dennis found that charming when they first met. Later, he found it embarrassing. He never told her to stop. He just stopped asking about it, and she stopped doing it the way you stop singing when you realize no one in the house is listening. Route 11 curved around a granite outcropping, and there it was. Macklin Gas and Service. Smaller than she remembered, or maybe she'd just gotten used to bigger things. A single-story cinder block building with a flat roof and 2 pump islands out front. The pumps rusted shut, their price displays frozen on numbers from the previous decade. Kudzu had swallowed the south wall and was reaching for the roofline with thick green fingers. The sign above the door, Earl had painted it himself. She remembered watching him on the ladder. The careful way he held the brush had faded, until the letters were barely visible ghosts of a name. One window had a crack running corner to corner, sealed with duct tape that had dried and curled away from the glass. But the walls were solid. The door was locked. The building was standing, which was more than Ruth could say for most things in her life right now. She found the key ring in the manila folder. Second key. The lock resisted, gritty and stiff, then turned with a click that echoed in the empty room. Inside, the air was still and heavy with dust. 12 years of dust undisturbed, layered on every surface like a quiet sermon about time. Late afternoon light came through the dirty windows and fell in pale rectangles across the concrete floor. A wooden counter ran along the back wall. Behind it, a pegboard where snack bags and road maps had once hung, the hooks still there, holding nothing. The cash register sat on the counter. An old mechanical one with actual push buttons and a drawer that was slightly open, as if Earl had stepped away for a moment and was coming right back. And beside the register, exactly where he'd left them 12 years ago, sat Earl's reading glasses, wire-rimmed. One temple slightly bent where he'd sat on them, and bent them back into shape with his fingers. Ruth picked them up. The lenses were dusty but unbroken. She cleaned them with the hem of her cardigan, a reflex so old it bypassed thought entirely. She used to hand them back to him 3 times an afternoon. He was always setting them down and forgetting where. Next to the glasses, a newspaper folded open to the crossword puzzle. Earl's handwriting, small and precise, filled the grid in block capitals. 27 across was done. 28 across was blank. The pen lay beside it as though he'd gotten up to check on something and never come back to finish. She set the glasses down and looked around the room. One large space divided by the counter. Stockroom in back. Door to the right leading to the repair bay. Narrow staircase on the left climbing to the apartment above where Earl had lived the last 20 years of his life alone after her mother passed. She climbed the stairs. The apartment was cramped and intact. A bed with a bare mattress, a dresser, a kitchen with a two-burner stove and a refrigerator that hummed when she plugged it in, which surprised her. The bathroom had a stand-up shower and a medicine cabinet stocked with Earl's toothbrush and a bottle of aspirin that expired 8 years ago. She opened the window above the bed. Mountain air pushed in and the staleness retreated, replaced by the scent of pine and cooling rock. And that particular Blue Ridge quiet that isn't silence at all, but the sound of everything that isn't human going about its evening. From the window she could see Route 11 curving down the mountain, and beyond it ridge lines layered in shades of blue and charcoal stacking into the distance until they dissolved into sky. The view hadn't changed. That was the thing about mountains. They didn't rearrange themselves while you were gone. Ruth sat on the mattress. The springs protested. She was 58 years old, sitting in her dead father's apartment above a closed gas station on a road that led to nothing, with $200 and a cardboard box, and no plan and no one expecting her anywhere. She didn't cry. She had finished crying weeks ago alone in the guest bedroom of the house on Briar Creek while Dennis slept in the master suite with the door closed. She had cried into a pillow so the sound wouldn't travel through the walls, which was the most pathetic detail of her entire life, and one she would never share with anyone. The crying was done. What she felt now was quieter than grief and wider. An emptiness that wasn't painful so much as vast, like standing at the edge of a field and realizing there was no fence. She went downstairs as the last light left the windows. The station felt different in the dark. Not abandoned. Something else. A held breath. A room waiting for someone to walk in and turn on the lamp. She moved behind the counter, running her hand along the surface, feeling the grooves and nicks from decades of use. Coins slid across this wood. Hands rested here while Earl made conversation about the weather, about someone's truck, about nothing in particular. The small, steady talk that holds a day together. Her fingers found something, a seam. Not a crack, a seam straight and deliberate in the wood paneling beneath the register. She knelt. The panel was about 2 feet square, fitted flush against the wall but not nailed. She worked her fingernails under the edge and pulled. It came away with a dry scrape. Behind it was a shallow cavity, and inside the cavity 3 objects that would change the rest of her life. A leather journal, thick, soft-covered, held shut with a rubber band. A metal lockbox, the kind you'd buy at a hardware store for $12. And a bundle of envelopes bound together with kitchen twine. Ruth's hands trembled as she lifted the journal out. The leather was worn smooth at the edges, darkened at the spots where fingers had gripped it thousands of times over what must have been decades. She slid off the rubber band, cracked and fragile, and opened to the first page. Earl's handwriting, small, neat, slanting to the right. September 14th, 1981. Lent Tom Hendricks $200 for the electric bill. Wife is due in March, and they can't afford to lose heat. Told him to pay when he can. He won't be able to. That's all right. She turned the page. Fixed Carol Dunbar's transmission. Charged her $30 for parts, nothing for labor. She's raising 3 kids alone since Ray left. The oldest helped me sweep the bay while Carol waited. Good kid. Quiet. Page after page, entry after entry. Names, amounts, reasons. Every loan Earl had ever made. Every repair he'd done for free. Every bag of groceries quietly placed in someone's truck while they were inside paying for gas. Hundreds of entries spanning 4 decades written in the same careful hand, each one a record of a kindness he never mentioned to a single person. Ruth sat on the floor behind the counter and read by the fading light, until she couldn't see the words anymore, and then she found a flashlight in the stockroom and kept reading. Earl hadn't kept a ledger of debts. He'd kept a record of needs. He noted when children were born, when someone lost a job, when a roof was leaking and the family couldn't afford to fix it. He tracked the loans that people paid back and quietly forgave the ones they couldn't. He didn't write about himself, not once. No complaints about money or loneliness or the daughter who stopped visiting. Just the needs of the valley and what he had done about them day after day after day. She opened the lockbox. Inside $412 in small bills. A set of keys she didn't recognize. A folded document that turned out to be the original deed from Earl's own father, dated 1971. The keys were brass, one of them small and flat. She didn't yet know what they opened. The envelopes were harder. Her hands shook as she untied the twine. 8 of them. Different handwriting on each one, all addressed to Earl. Thank you letters. One from a woman named Linda, whose family would have lost their farm without Earl's loan. One from a man named Curtis, who wrote that Earl's $50 got him through the worst month of his life. Simple notes on notebook paper on the backs of receipts on whatever was handy when the gratitude became too heavy to carry in silence. She read them all. She read them twice. Then she found the last envelope at the bottom of the stack, and everything stopped. It was sealed. The others had been opened, read, and saved. This one was still closed. And on the front, in Earl's block capitals, the same handwriting that filled the crossword and labeled every tool in the repair bay, was a single word. Ruth. She turned it over. Her name on a sealed envelope hidden in a wall. A letter her father had written and never sent. Or maybe had always intended for her to find exactly this way, exactly when she needed it. She slid her finger under the flap and pulled out 2 sheets of yellow legal paper folded in thirds. Dear Ruth, if you're reading this, you found your way back. I always knew you would. She leaned against the counter and held the pages close to the flashlight. I wrote this on a Tuesday in October. The leaves are turning and business is slow, which means I have too much time to think. That's dangerous for an old man with a pen and a wall to hide things in. I want you to know something about this station. It's not worth much on paper. A building inspector would condemn half of it, and a real estate agent would call it a teardown. But it's worth everything to the people who depend on it. I don't mean the gas or the repairs, though those matter. I mean the fact that it's here, that someone is behind the counter, that the coffee is on and the light is on and the door is open. That matters more than you think. I know about Dennis. I've known for a long time. You think you hid it well, but a father hears what a father hears. He's not a bad man, Ruth. He's just a man who measures everything in dollars and thinks that's the same as value. Someday you'll see the difference. I hope it doesn't cost you too much to learn it. This station is yours, not because it's worth money, because you're the only person I trust to understand what it was for. Don't sell it. And if you can keep the coffee on. The letter was signed with just his name, Earl. Ruth pressed the pages against her chest and closed her eyes. The station was dark. Through the cracked window, she could see stars above the ridgeline, more stars than she'd seen in 30 years of suburban living. A sky so thick with light, it looked like something had shattered up there, and no one had swept it up. The mountain was silent. No traffic, no television through walls. No sound of Dennis moving through the house on the other side of a locked door. Nothing but the building settling into its bones, and the wind moving through the gap in the window, and the faint electrical hum of a refrigerator upstairs that had waited 12 years for someone to plug it back in. She sat on the floor of her father's gas station, holding the record of a life spent in service to other people. A life that looked like nothing from the outside, a man pumping gas on a road nobody used, and was everything from the inside. Earl Macklin hadn't been running a gas station. He'd been holding an entire valley together with his bare hands, one small kindness at a time, and he'd never said a word about it. Not to his customers, not to his friends, not to his own daughter. Ruth looked at the counter, the reading glasses, the crossword puzzle. 27 across filled in, 28 across still blank. She didn't know what the answer was, not yet. But she knew she wasn't going to sell this place. She knew it the way you know the ground is solid, not because someone told you, but because you're standing on it. She locked the front door, climbed the stairs, and lay down on the bare mattress. The springs settled beneath her. The window was still open, and the night air carried the smell of pine and cold stone, and something she hadn't felt in so long she'd almost forgotten the word for it. Possibility. She was 58 years old, broke, divorced, sleeping above an abandoned gas station on a road most people had forgotten existed. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, she knew exactly what she was going to do next. What Ruth discovers in that filing cabinet the next morning, and the stranger who breaks down on Route 11 with a secret that connects him to Earl in ways neither of them could have imagined. That's where this story truly begins. Stay with me. Ruth woke to birdsong and the smell of dust. Pale light through the apartment window. For a moment she didn't know where she was. Then the water-stained ceiling came into focus, low and familiar, in a way that bypassed thought, and she remembered. She washed her face in the bathroom sink. The water ran brown for 10 seconds, then clear and cold straight from the mountain. She brushed her teeth with a finger and some of Earl's expired toothpaste, which tasted like chalk and mint and thyme. In the kitchen, she found a sealed can of coffee in the cabinet, stale but not ruined. The two-burner stove lit on the second try, and she heated water in a dented saucepan because there was no kettle. She carried her mug downstairs and walked the property in the early light. The repair bay was in better shape than the main building. Earl had built it himself in the 70s. Poured the concrete floor, hung the doors, wired the overhead lights. Two bays, one with a hydraulic lift. His tools hung on a pegboard that covered the entire back wall, organized by size and type, each one outlined in black marker, so you'd know what was missing. Wrenches, sockets, screwdrivers, pliers, a torque. Wrench still in its case. The rubber grip on his favorite ratchet was worn glassy smooth from 40 years of use. Ruth ran her hand along the workbench. Her fingers found the groove she'd carved when she was 9, dragging a flathead screwdriver while Earl wasn't looking. He found it the next day and shook his head. Now the bench has character. In the corner stood a green metal filing cabinet, the heavy 4-drawer kind built to survive a flood. She tried the top drawer, locked. She went back to the lockbox and tried the brass key, the small flat one. It fit every drawer. Inside were folders, dozens of them, alphabetical by family name, each containing handwritten notes in Earl's script. But these weren't just financial records. They were follow-ups. Progress reports on the people he'd helped, written over years, sometimes decades. Hendricks Tom, paid back $50 in June. Baby girl healthy, 7 pounds 4 ounces. Named her Rose after his mother. Don't mention the rest of the debt. Dunbar Carroll, oldest, got into community college. Gave her $200 for books. She tried to refuse. Left it in the glove box of her car. Sutter Jim, roof held through the winter. Patched the south side myself in October. He doesn't know. Thinks the landlord fixed it. Ruth sat on a milk crate and read folder after folder. Earl hadn't just lent money and walked away. He'd tracked these families for decades, checking in without them knowing. Fixing what they couldn't afford, noting the births of their children and the outcomes of their surgeries, and whether the furnace made it through February. A man who barely covered his own bills had spent his life making sure the valley didn't lose anyone to the cracks. She was still reading when she heard tires on gravel. Through the bay door, she saw an old Chevy truck rolling up to the pump islands. A man climbed out, heavy-set and deliberate, plaid flannel, a cap with a feed store logo. He stood with his hands on his hips, studying the building with the expression of someone seeing a ghost and deciding whether to speak to it. Ruth stepped out of the bay. Morning. The man turned. Deeply lined face, white stubble, sun-darkened skin that had been sun-darkened for decades. He squinted at her for a long moment, and then something shifted behind his eyes and he took off his cap. I'll be damned. You're Earl's girl, Ruth Macklin, Hank Dawson. He extended a hand that could have palmed a basketball. I live 2 miles down. Your daddy and I played cards every Thursday for longer than I can count. I remember. You used to bring corn from your garden. Still do. though there's nobody to bring it to anymore. He looked at the station, then back at her. What brings you up here? She could have said anything, could have deflected, could have lied. My husband divorced me. He got the house and everything in it. This is all I have left. Hank nodded. He didn't offer sympathy. He didn't tilt his head or soften his voice or say the things people say when they want to seem kind without getting involved. He walked back to his truck and returned with a thermos and 2 ceramic mugs. Well then, you'll need good coffee, not whatever ancient can you found in Earl's cabinet. They sat on overturned buckets on the cracked concrete apron, drinking coffee that was dark and strong, and better than anything Ruth had tasted in months. The sun was clearing the eastern ridge, and the light came through the trees in long gold columns that turned the dust on the pump islands into something close to beautiful. Tell me about him, the things he didn't tell me. Hank sipped and studied the mountains. Your daddy was a complicated man in a simple way. Worked hard, kept his head down, didn't talk about himself. But he had a thing about people. Couldn't stand to see anyone struggle if he could do something about it. I found his journal behind the counter. Hank's eyebrows rose. He wrote everything down. Every family, every loan, every repair he did for free. Hank shook his head, smiling. That stubborn fool. I only caught him once. Loading groceries into the Sutter family's truck at midnight. Said he was reorganizing inventory. Reorganizing it right into their back seat. Ruth laughed. It came out sudden and unguarded, and it surprised her the way a door surprises you when it opens into a room you forgot was there. She couldn't remember the last time she'd made that sound. Folks around here still talk about him, Hank said. Not speeches, quiet things. Someone mentions their light stayed on because of Earl. Their car made it through another winter because Earl fixed it for the cost of parts. He paused. Earl Macklin died owing nothing to anyone and being owed by everyone. That was the richest a man could be. They finished their coffee. Hank left with a promise to bring lumber for the porch railing. Ruth stood alone in front of the station and looked at it clearly in daylight without the fog of exhaustion that had carried her through the previous night. The kudzu, the cracked windows, the rusted pumps, the sign she could barely read. She made a list on the back of one of Earl's old receipts. It filled the back of the receipt and continued onto the counter, and she was still writing when she ran out of room. Broken windows, porch railing, gutters, kudzu, water damage south wall, pump islands, wiring. Every item on the list cost money she didn't have. She started with what was free, her hands. The kudzu came first. She pulled it from the south wall by hand, grabbing fistfuls of vine and wrenching them free from the mortar between the cinder blocks. The roots had worked deep over the years, and every pull was a negotiation. The vine resisting the wall, groaning, Ruth's shoulders burning by the second hour. She filled the wheelbarrow behind the building, dumped it, filled it again. By noon, the pile of dead vine was taller than she was, and her palms were raw and bleeding at the base of each finger. She washed them under the outside faucet and kept working. At noon, a woman she didn't recognize pulled up in a minivan and left a casserole on the front step with a note that said, "Welcome home, Earl's daughter." Ruth didn't know her name or how she knew Ruth was there. She hadn't told anyone except Hank. By afternoon, 3 more people had stopped. An elderly man left a stack of firewood by the side of the building without a word. A couple brought cleaning supplies in a plastic bin. A teenage girl dropped off a bag of groceries, waved shyly through the windshield, and drove away before Ruth could reach the parking lot. Each one left the same message. Different words, same meaning. Earl helped us once. We are glad you're here. Ruth carried the groceries upstairs. Bread, eggs, milk, canned soup, a bag of apples. She made a sandwich and ate it standing at the apartment window, looking down at the pump islands. Rusted, locked, the hoses cracked. Getting them running would cost thousands, but the bay was functional. The tools were there, and she was Earl Macklin's daughter, which meant she knew her way around an engine, even if she hadn't touched one in 2 decades. She went back to the bay that afternoon and started testing the hydraulic lift. The first pump coughed oil when she hit the switch and didn't move. She bled the lines, cleaned the filter, tried again. It rose 6 inches and stopped. She bled the lines again, found a cracked fitting, wrapped it with Teflon tape from Earl's supply shelf, and tried a third time. The lift rose. Slowly complaining, but it rose, and when it reached full height and the safety clicked, Ruth stood under it with grease on her forearms and felt something she hadn't felt in 33 years. Competence. The plain satisfaction of fixing a thing with your hands and watching it work. Her hands remembered what her mind had tried to forget. The weight of a socket wrench, the resistance of a rusted bolt, the particular vibration that runs through a ratchet when the fastener finally breaks free. She'd buried all of it years ago because Dennis found it embarrassing. And now it came back the way buried things always come back, whole and waiting, and slightly angry about the delay. Late in the afternoon, with the sun dropping behind the western ridge, she heard an engine struggling on the road. She stepped outside and saw a white pickup limping toward the station, steam rising from beneath the hood like a distress signal. It rolled past the building 20 yards and stopped. A young man climbed out, maybe 23. Lean and sunburned gray t-shirt with grease stains, jeans torn at the knee, work boots that had seen more work than most men his age would see in a lifetime. He popped the hood and stared at the engine with the focused expression of someone who understood exactly what he was looking at and didn't have the means to fix it. Ruth walked over. Radiator. He looked up. Hose blue. Upper one. He wiped sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. I've got a spare in the bed, but I don't have tools. I've got tools. She nodded at the bay. Pull it in if it'll make it. He looked at her, then at the station, then back at her. His face showed the quick math of someone accustomed to calculating risk, the hesitation of a person who'd learned that help always came with a price tag or a lecture, or both. I can pay for the bay time. I didn't ask for money. I said pull it in. His name was Jesse Rowan. He drove the truck into the bay and had the blown hose off in 6 minutes. His hands moved with a precision that didn't come from training. It came from years, the kind of years that start before you're old enough to choose them. Ruth found a replacement hose in Earl's stockroom that was close enough to work with a couple of extra clamps. She handed it to him and watched him install it. Where'd you learn to wrench? My grandmother's boyfriend had a shop in Boone. Spent every summer there until I was 16. He tightened the last clamp without looking up. Haven't worked in a proper shop since. Last 3 places didn't work out. Ruth didn't ask why. She could read the story in the set of his jaw, in the way he kept his answers short and his eyes down, in the careful distance he maintained, even while accepting help. Young, no family support, probably sleeping in that truck. A torn seam in the fabric of things. The kind of person Earl would have noticed before anyone else in the room. I'm reopening this station. The words came out before she'd fully decided they were true. But the moment they were in the air, she knew they'd been true since she read Earl's letter. I need someone who can turn a wrench. Jesse looked at her steadily. You don't know anything about me. I know you replace that hose faster than most mechanics with twice your experience. That's enough for today. He didn't say yes. He finished the coolant, started the engine, listened to it, run the way you listen to a heartbeat when you're not sure it'll hold. Then he closed the hood and wiped his hands on a rag from Earl's bench. I'll think about it. Come back tomorrow if you decide. I'll have coffee on. He drove off down Route 11. Ruth watched his taillights disappear around the curve and went inside. She washed the mugs, wiped the counter, and stood for a moment in front of the crossword puzzle. 28 across was still blank. She didn't touch it. She locked the door and went upstairs. Tomorrow she'd either have a mechanic or she wouldn't. Either way, the coffee would be on. Jesse's truck pulled into the lot at 7 the next morning. Ruth was already downstairs sweeping the front apron. Coffee's on. You said it would be. She handed him a mug. He took it and drank without asking what was in it. "I'll work a week, see how it goes." Fair enough. That was how it started. One mug and a handshake that wasn't a handshake, just two people deciding to try. They divided the work without discussion. Jesse took the bay. Ruth took the building. Hank arrived at 9 with a truck bed full of lumber and rebuilt the porch railing by 11:30. Ruth brought him water and watched him lean his full weight against it. Earl would have used cedar. Earl could afford cedar. Pine'll do. That was the rhythm. Ruth and Jesse worked sunrise to dark, and Hank appeared most mornings with materials and 40 years of knowing how things fit together. Ruth tried to pay him once. He looked at her the way you'd look at someone who tried to pay for rain. Earl helped me reshingle my roof in '98. 3 days. Wouldn't take a dime. Told me I could buy him a steak when I won the lottery. He hammered a nail into the porch step. Never won the lottery. So this is the steak. Jesse replaced the cracked front window. Ruth painted the trim dark green from a can in the stockroom. Jesse got the furnace running after 2 afternoons of extracting bird nests and replacing a corroded ignition switch. That furnace should have been condemned years ago, he told her. But it's stubborn, runs in the family. It was the fourth night, a Wednesday, when Ruth saw the light on in the bay at 11 o'clock. She came downstairs and found Jesse sitting on the floor against the wall, wrapped in a sleeping bag. The bay door cracked open for air. His truck was parked outside. The cab had a blanket balled up on the bench seat and a duffel bag that held everything he owned. He looked up when she appeared in the doorway. Neither of them spoke for a moment. "The spare room upstairs has a bed frame. No mattress yet, but I'll find one. I'm fine here. Nobody's fine sleeping on concrete, Jesse." He studied her face, looking for the catch. The condition. The thing people always wanted in exchange for a hand up. Ruth looked back at him and offered nothing but the statement and the silence around it. He nodded once and went back to staring at the wall. Ruth found a mattress at a yard sale that Saturday. $15. Jesse carried it upstairs without a word. It was Hank who told her the following Tuesday over coffee on the porch. Not gossip. Hank didn't gossip. He told her the way a man tells you about weather plainly, because you'll need to know. The boy did 14 months at a state facility outside Roanoke. Stole a car when he was 19. Wrong crowd, wrong night. He did his time. Got out and nobody would hire him. That was 2 years ago. He's been bouncing ever since. Ruth looked at the bay door. She could hear the compressor running inside Jesse, testing the lines he'd bled that morning. Is that why the last 3 shops didn't work out? That's why everything doesn't work out for a kid like that. You get a number, and the number follows you into every room before you do. She didn't bring it up with Jesse. She didn't change how she spoke to him, what she asked of him, how much she paid him. She understood something about being defined by a single chapter of your life, about having the worst thing you ever did become the only thing anyone remembered. She'd spent 33 years being defined as Dennis Macklin's wife. A different kind of prison, but she recognized the bars. Jesse understood that she knew. She could see it in the way he looked at her the morning after Hank's visit. A flicker of something behind his eyes that might have been fear. And then, when nothing changed, might have been gratitude. Neither of them named it. Some things survive better without language. The pumps were the biggest problem. Ruth called every fuel company within 50 miles. Most of them hung up when she described the location. The fourth was run by a man named Grady, who went quiet when she said her name. Earl Macklin's daughter. Your daddy kept my trucks running when I was starting out. Wouldn't charge me full price because he said a man trying to build something shouldn't be punished for it. Grady sent a crew the following week. They flushed the underground tanks, tested the lines, and installed 2 new pump heads. Ruth signed a fuel contract with terms she could barely make if enough cars stopped. It was a gamble built on a prayer, built on a memory of a man who'd been dead for 12 years. The first customer came on a Thursday, an older woman in a white sedan rolling down her window slowly. "Are you open?" "We are." The woman got out and looked at the station. the way people look at a photograph of someone they used to love. She filled up, and Ruth checked her tires without being asked. When the woman reached for her wallet to pay for the check, Ruth waved her off. Your daddy did the same thing, exact same wave. After that, the cars came. Not many, but enough. People from the valley who remembered the station and the man who ran it. They came for gas and stayed for the porch. Ruth bought a proper coffee maker with the last of the lockbox money. Hank told her she'd burn through £1 a week. Earl went through 2. Earl had more visitors. Give it time. Then came the afternoon that changed everything for Jesse. He was in the bay, reorganizing the filing cabinet Ruth had been slowly working through. She heard the metallic slide of a drawer, the rustle of folders, and then silence. Not the silence of concentration, a different kind, the kind that has weight. She walked to the bay door. Jesse was sitting on the milk crate with a folder open on his lap. He was staring at a single sheet of paper as though it had reached up and grabbed him by the throat. Jesse. He didn't look up. She walked over and stood beside him. The folder tab read, Rowan in Earl's handwriting. Inside a single page, Clara Rowan. Heart valve replacement, August 1994. $3,200. Sent through the doctor's office as anonymous donation. She can't know where it came from. Jesse's hands were trembling. He closed the folder and pressed it flat against his knees. My grandmother. His voice was tight but controlled, the voice of someone holding himself together by deciding to 1 second at a time. She had heart surgery when I was a baby. Told me someone paid for it. Anonymous. She looked for that person her whole life. Never found out. He looked up at Ruth. She told me that story every single time I visited. Every time. Said whoever paid for that surgery was the reason our whole family existed. My mother, my uncle, me, all of us. Because some stranger decided Grandma Clara was worth $3,200. Ruth sat on the concrete floor beside the milk crate. She didn't speak. There are moments that need nothing from you except your presence, and this was one of them. I didn't even know she'd been to this station, Jessie said. She lived in Boone. That's 40 miles from here. Earl drove to Boone sometimes. He told me he was visiting a friend. Jessie folded the page and placed it back in the folder with a care that bordered on reverence. He sat holding it on his lap, looking at Earl's tools hanging on the pegboard, each one inside its black outline like a silhouette waiting to be filled. He never met me. He never knew I'd exist. But the reason I'm here, the reason any of us are here, is because a man pumping gas on a road nobody drives paid for a stranger's surgery and never said a word. That's who he was. Jessie nodded. He stood, returned the folder to the cabinet, and closed the drawer. He went back to work. He didn't say anything else, and Ruth didn't need him to. But he stayed later that night than any night before. And when he cleaned Earl's tools before locking up every wrench, every socket, every screwdriver back in its outline, he handled each one the way you handle something that belongs to someone you wish you'd had the chance to know. A man named Wade Sutter came to the station on a Friday afternoon. Ruth knew the name from Earl's files. Jim Sutter's son, the family whose roof Earl had patched without telling them. Wade ran the building supply store 12 miles down the mountain. Thick-necked, hard-mouthed, driving a truck that was newer than anything in the lot. He didn't buy gas. He didn't sit on the porch. He stood in front of the counter with his arms crossed and looked at Ruth with the flat, assessing stare of someone who'd already made up his mind. I knew your father. Everybody did. But I also know you left this valley 30 years ago, married money, and never came back once. Not for holidays, not for his birthday, not for anything except the funeral, and you stayed 3 days for that. Ruth set down the rag she'd been using to wipe the counter. She didn't flinch. Now you're divorced and broke, and suddenly you care about Earl's station. He leaned forward slightly. I give it 6 months. You'll get a good offer from a developer when that highway comes through. You'll sell and you'll disappear again. That's what people like you do. Ruth looked at him for a long time. She thought about arguing. She thought about defending herself, explaining the years with Dennis, the slow disappearance of who she'd been. But Wade Sutter wasn't asking for an explanation. He was telling her what he believed, and no explanation would change it. Only time would. Coffee's on the table if you want some, Wade. He stared at her. Then he shook his head, turned, and walked out. The screen door slapped shut behind him. Jesse appeared in the bay doorway. He'd heard everything. You all right? Ruth picked up the rag and went back to wiping the counter. Some people need to be angry at something. Might as well be me for a while. 2 weeks passed. The station settled into its rhythm. Jesse handled the repair work with a focus that deepened every day. He'd enrolled in an online mechanic certification program studying on a used laptop Ruth bought from a pawn shop with money she'd made from oil changes. He sat at the counter after closing, reading about fuel injection systems and taking notes in a composition book with handwriting that had gotten neater since he'd started small block letters that tilted to the right. Ruth noticed but didn't mention it. Some things you just let happen. The porch regulars multiplied. An older man brought a checkerboard and left it on the railing. Within a week, there was a running tournament nobody kept official score of, and everyone took deadly seriously. Ruth learned their names, their families, who was behind on bills, who had a new grandchild who needed a brake job, but was putting it off because the numbers didn't work. She kept this information the way Earl had, in her head and in her actions, quietly. The man with the brakes came to pick up his truck and found the work done the invoice listing pads only. A woman whose husband had recently left found an envelope of grocery money tucked under her sun visor. Ruth didn't make announcements. The valley absorbed it the way it had absorbed Earl's generosity, as part of the way things were. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday. Ruth was behind the counter, refilling the coffee maker. Jesse was in the bay. Hank had gone home an hour before. The mail carrier, she'd only recently started getting mail here, left a single envelope on the counter beside Earl's glasses, and the crossword puzzle where 28 across was still blank. White envelope. Heavy stock. Return address she recognized before she finished reading it. Felton and Associates. She opened it standing up. Read it once fast, then again slow. The language was dense, but the meaning underneath was a knife. Dennis was filing a motion to reopen the divorce settlement. His lawyers claimed the gas station property had been undervalued during division. They cited a planned state highway expansion that would increase the land's assessed value significantly. They wanted the court to either award Dennis his equitable share or force a sale. Ruth set the letter on the counter. Her hands were steady, her stomach was not. She read it a third time, looking for a crack in the argument, some exception or loophole that would make the threat smaller. She didn't find one. She thought about a lawyer. She didn't know any. The ones she could find would charge money she didn't have. The fuel sales barely covered the contract payments and Jess's wages. The lockbox was empty. The checking account held $87 and would hold less after the electric bill cleared. She couldn't afford to fight this, and Dennis knew it. That was the strategy. It had always been the strategy, not winning, just making the fight expensive enough that the other person couldn't afford to show up. Jessie came in from the bay, saw the letter, saw her face. What happened? My ex-husband is taking me to court, wants the station, or he's cut of it. Can he do that? His lawyers think so. Jesse picked up the letter and read it. His jaw tightened. He set it down next to Earl's glasses, next to the crossword where 27 across was filled in, and 28 across was still waiting next to the reading glasses that still carried the faint oil smudge of a man who'd spent his life fixing things for people who couldn't pay. What are you going to do? Ruth looked at the station, at the clean windows and the dark green trim and the coffee maker by the door and Hank's checkerboard on the porch railing. At the life she'd built in 6 weeks from nothing but a dead man's tools and an open door. I don't know yet, but I'm not leaving. She locked up that night and climbed the stairs. lay on the mattress and stared at the ceiling and listened to the mountains settle into darkness. Somewhere below, she could hear Jesse in his room, the faint tap of his laptop keys, studying, preparing for a future he was building one page at a time. She thought about the families in Earl's journal who had faced worse than this with less than this. She thought about Earl, who had never once backed down from something that mattered, who had paid for a stranger's heart surgery and patched a neighbor's roof in secret and kept the coffee on and the light on and the door open for 40 years on a road most people had forgotten existed. Earl had always known what to do next. Ruth didn't. But she was learning something Earl probably knew all along, that you don't have to know what comes next. You just have to still be standing there when it arrives. She closed her eyes. The mountains were black against the window. The stars were out in their thousands. And somewhere in a filing cabinet downstairs in a green metal drawer, labeled with the careful handwriting of a man who believed that every person was worth the trouble, the evidence of an entire life spent proving that kindness wasn't weakness was waiting for a courtroom it might never see. But Ruth wasn't thinking about courtrooms. She was thinking about coffee, about keeping it on, about what Earl had written in a letter hidden in a wall, meant for a daughter he hoped would come home. That matters more than you think. She held on to that sentence the way you hold on to a railing in the dark, and she waited for morning. Connie called that evening. Ruth was on the porch watching the last light drain from the ridgeline, the letter folded in her back pocket like a stone she couldn't set down. Mom, I heard about the lawyer's letter, how Dad told me. Of course he did. Dennis was building his case the way he built everything framing the walls, before anyone realized the foundation had already been poured, lining up allies, making sure the story that reached the courtroom was the one he'd written. He says the property is worth more than what was declared. He says there's a highway coming through. There's always a highway coming through somewhere, Connie. Doesn't mean it's coming here. Mom, listen. If the property is worth something, why not sell? Take the money, get an apartment, start over properly. I'm not selling. Why not? Because this isn't about money. Connie went quiet. Ruth could hear her breathing slow, measured the kind that meant she was choosing her next words the way you choose a tool, carefully knowing it could fix something or break it. Mom, I'm worried about you. You're living in a building that should probably be condemned, working a gas pump, and now Dad is taking you to court. How is any of this okay? Jesse fixed the furnace. The building is fine. Who is Jesse? He works here. You hired someone with what money? Connie, I'm handling it. That's what you always say. And then Dad handles it. The words landed the way a stone lands in still water, a single point of impact, and then rings moving outward, touching everything. Ruth closed her eyes. She could have told her daughter the truth, that Dennis never handled anything except his own comfort. That handling was just a polite word for a particular kind of disappearance, the kind where you stop making decisions because someone else has decided that your decisions don't matter. That Connie had grown up inside Dennis's version of the world and had never been shown that other versions existed. She didn't say any of it, not because she was afraid, because the time wasn't right and Ruth was learning to tell the difference. I love you. I'll call you this weekend. She hung up and sat in the dark. The mountains were a black wall against a sky full of cold light. She went inside and made a fresh pot of coffee, because that was what you did. You made coffee and kept the light on and waited for morning. Earl had done it for 40 years. She could do it for one night. Hank found her behind the counter the next morning. He looked at the letter still sitting beside Earl's glasses, and then at her. Dennis was here, mountain news, fastest thing in the valley. He poured himself coffee and settled onto the stool. What's he want, the station? Or his share of it? His lawyers think the land's worth more because of some highway expansion. Hank set his mug down. They've been talking about that highway since before your daddy died. Never happens, but that won't stop a lawyer from billing hours over it. I can't afford a lawyer, Hank. I can barely afford the coffee." Hank was quiet for a moment, turning the mug in his hands, the way he did when he was thinking through something that had more than one side. "There's a woman in Barton, retired attorney, moved up from Richmond 5 or 6 years back. Her daughter was sick when she was little, needed surgery the family couldn't cover. Ruth waited. Earl paid for it, took it out of the station's earnings. Never told anyone, but she found out. People around here always find out. You think she'd help? I think if you tell her you're Earl Macklin's daughter and your ex-husband is trying to take what Earl left you, she'll drive up this mountain so fast the gravel won't settle for an hour." Hank made the call that afternoon. The attorney arrived the next morning in a gray sedan that had been driven hard and maintained carefully. The car of someone who respected function over appearance. Margaret Greer, late 60s. Tall, straight-backed reading glasses on a chain around her neck. She carried a leather briefcase the color of dark honey, creased and scratched from years of courtrooms and conference tables, and the particular kind of work that matters most when everything else has fallen apart. She shook Ruth's hand on the porch. Firm grip, dry palm, eyes that read the situation before the situation announced itself. "Hank told me what's happening. I'd like to hear it from you." They sat at the counter. Margaret read the letter, slowly turning pages with the calm of someone who had read thousands of documents exactly like it and had stopped being impressed by legal language sometime in the previous century. "This is a nuisance claim. Your ex-husband's lawyers know it, and he probably knows it too. But nuisance claims work because most people can't afford to fight them. Pressure until you fold. That's the strategy. Can he win? Not if the property was never marital. Was the station ever in both your names? Number. Earl left it to me alone. Did you and your husband ever use the property, pay taxes on it together? Make improvements? Dennis never set foot here until 3 days ago. I haven't paid taxes on it in years. The county sent notices, but the amounts were small, and I just ignored them. That's actually helpful. If neither of you maintained, improved, or used the property during the marriage, it stays separate." His lawyers cited a highway expansion. Margaret waved a hand, the way you wave away a fly that doesn't deserve the effort. Speculative future value isn't grounds for reopening a settlement. They'd need to prove the value was deliberately concealed at the time of the divorce. Was it? His own lawyers appraised it at $14,000. They let me keep it without a fight. Then they assessed it and dismissed it. That's their problem, not yours. She stood and collected the papers. "I'll need the original deed and any inheritance documents. My father kept everything. Then let's go find them." Ruth led her to the bay to the green filing cabinet. They went through it drawer by drawer. Margaret was precise, separating what mattered from what didn't, with the efficiency of someone who had spent a career knowing the difference. The original deed was in the bottom drawer in a manila envelope labeled "Property in Earl's handwriting." Inside, the deed from Earl's father, dated 1971, transferring the land and building to Earl Robert Macklin. Below it, Earl's will. Witness notarized leaving the property solely to Ruth Ann Macklin. Margaret held both documents up to the light coming through the bay door. "This is clean. Property passed from your grandfather to your father and from your father to you. Never jointly held. Never commingled with marital assets. Never improved with marital funds. His motion will be dismissed. You're sure? I practiced law for 31 years before I retired." "I'm sure." Ruth leaned against the workbench. The relief didn't come all at once. It came the way heat comes back to cold hands, slowly, painfully, each nerve remembering what warmth felt like and protesting the return. "What do I owe you?" Margaret looked at her. The reading glasses caught the light. "Your father paid for my daughter's surgery when I couldn't afford it. I didn't know it was him for years. When I found out, I drove to this station to thank him, and he pretended he didn't know what I was talking about. Told me I had the wrong gas station." She picked up her briefcase. "There's nothing you owe me, Ruth. This one was paid for a long time ago. She left her card on the counter and drove away. Ruth stood on the porch and watched the gray sedan wind down the mountain road. And she stood there a while after it was gone, listening to the quiet feeling, the particular weight of a debt being settled across decades by people who never agreed on the terms. The hearing was on a Wednesday 6 weeks later. Ruth drove the Ford to the county courthouse. Margaret met her on the steps in a navy suit carrying a folder with 3 documents inside. The original deed, Earl's will, a chain of title summary from the clerk's office. The courtroom was smaller than the one where Ruth had signed her divorce papers. Dennis sat in the front row beside Felton. Same charcoal suit, same posture. He didn't look at her. The hearing lasted 20 minutes. Margaret presented the documents and explained the chain of ownership. The tax records confirmed Dennis had never paid $1 toward the property. His own legal team had appraised it during the divorce and dismissed it as negligible. This property was separate before the marriage and separate at dissolution. There is no legal basis for reopening the settlement. The judge reviewed the papers. He asked Felton for a response. Felton talked about potential future value and equitable distribution, but the words had no weight. They fell on the courtroom floor like coins that turned out to be buttons. Motion denied. The property was never marital. This matter is closed. Ruth exhaled. It was the first full breath she'd taken in 6 weeks. Outside, the sun was warm on the courthouse steps. Ruth was almost to her truck when she heard footsteps behind her. Dennis stood on the bottom step, jacket over one arm, sunglasses off. He looked different than he had at the station. The confidence was still there, structural load-bearing, but something behind it had shifted. He looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with the drive or the hearing or the loss of a legal argument that was never going to win. He looked tired the way a man looks when he's beginning to suspect that the house he built has no rooms he wants to live in. When did you become this person? He'd asked her this at the station weeks ago, but the voice was different now, not accusation, something closer to bewilderment. The genuine confusion of someone who spent 33 years measuring a woman in the wrong units and was only now realizing the instrument was broken. Ruth looked at him, the man she'd married at 25. The man who knew the price of every property in the county and the value of nothing that couldn't be appraised. I always was Dennis. You just never looked. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he nodded. Not agreement. Recognition. The small, terrible acknowledgement that she might be right, and that if she was, the implications ran backward through every year of their marriage and touched everything. He walked to his car. Ruth walked to hers. Neither of them said goodbye. Some endings don't need one. She drove home. The word came easily now, without effort, without quotation marks. Home. Connie arrived on a Saturday unannounced in a rental car. She brought the children. A boy of 9 and a girl of 6, both in city clothes, both wide-eyed at the gravel and the mountains and the gas pumps and a world that had nothing in common with theirs. This is where your great-grandpa Earl worked, Connie told them on the porch. It's small, the boy said. Big enough, Ruth said from the doorway. She took them through the station, showed them the counter, the reading glasses, the crossword. Let the girl ring up an imaginary sale on the old mechanical register, the buttons clicking under her small fingers. Then the bay. Jesse slid out from under a truck on the creeper, wiped his hands and said hello with the awkward gentleness of someone who hadn't spent much time around children and was afraid of getting it wrong. Ruth showed them Earl's tools, lifted the boy so he could see the pegboard, the outlines around every wrench and socket. She let the girl hold the flashlight while she explained tire pressure. Press it here. And this number tells you if there's enough air. What if there isn't? Then you add some. Compressor's right there. The boy pressed the gauge to the valve stem. 32, perfect. You just did your first tire check. He grinned. The same grin Ruth had worn at his age in this same bay with the same gauge in her hand and the same man's tools on the wall. She felt it in her chest, a fullness that had nothing to do with air, and everything to do with a line being drawn between then and now, and forward a thread that didn't break just because the person who started it was gone. That evening, after the children had fallen asleep on the couch upstairs, Ruth and Connie sat on the porch. The sky was clear. The stars were doing what they always did up here, reminding you that your problems were real and important, and also very, very small. I was wrong, Connie said, about all of it. This place, you. She turned her mug in her hands. Dad called me last week. Sounded different, quieter. Asked about you. What did you tell him? The truth. That you are doing better than anyone expected. That the station is running and people come from all over the valley. She paused. I told him you turned into someone he never imagined you could be. And I said that's because he never tried to imagine it. Ruth reached over and squeezed her daughter's hand. He wasn't a bad man, Connie. He just measured the wrong things. They sat together until the coffee was gone, and the stars had shifted, and the mountain air turned cold enough to see their breath. Then Connie went upstairs to sleep beside her children, and Ruth sat alone on the porch a while longer, listening to the silence that wasn't silence at all, but the sound of a valley breathing in its sleep. The next morning after Connie left, after the hug that lasted longer than any hug they'd shared in 20 years after the rental car disappeared around the curve and the dust settled, Ruth found Wade Sutter's truck in the lot. He was standing by the south wall of the building, the one Ruth had stripped of kudzu with her bare hands. He had a truck bed full of cinder blocks and a bucket of morite. His son was with him. 17 slouching earbuds in the practiced disinterest of a teenager who'd been dragged somewhere against his will. Wade looked at Ruth. She looked at him. He didn't apologize for what he'd said weeks ago. He didn't explain why he was here. He just nodded at the wall, mortars crumbling on the lower courses. I brought enough to repoint the whole south side. Ruth looked at the blocks, at the bucket, at the boy who was watching Jesse through the bay door, with something that might have been curiosity trying to disguise itself as boredom. Coffee's on. Wade almost smiled. It was the first time she'd seen his face do anything other than accuse. He took the mug she brought him and drank it standing beside the wall, studying the mortar joints the way a man studies something he's already decided to fix. His son drifted into the bay. Jessie was walking a nervous girl through her first oil change, explaining each step, letting her hold the wrench. The boy pulled out his earbuds and watched. After 10 minutes, he asked a question. Jessie answered it without making him feel stupid for asking. Wade worked on the wall all morning. He didn't say much. Ruth didn't push. When he left, he said he'd be back Thursday to finish. Ruth poured the last of his coffee onto the gravel and washed the mug. Some apologies don't come in words. They come in cinder blocks and mortar. And a man showing up to fix what he can because that's the only language he knows. Ruth closed the station at dusk. Jessie had already locked the bay and gone upstairs. Hank's firewood stood in neat rows along the wall, enough for another 2 weeks. The checkerboard on the porch railing was set for tomorrow's game. The coffee pot was off, but the smell of it lingered in the room, mixed with motor oil and pine, and the faint mineral scent of the mountain itself. She walked behind the counter, picked up Earl's reading glasses, and cleaned them with the hem of her shirt the way she had 10,000 times as a girl, holding them up to the window to check for smudges. She set them back beside the crossword puzzle, 27 across, filled in. Earl's careful block capitals, 28 across, still blank, waiting for 12 years. Ruth picked up the pen. It was a simple ballpoint, the kind gas stations used to give away with a fill-up. She looked at the clue for 28 across. 4 letters. The answer had probably been obvious to Earl. It was obvious to her now. She wrote it in his handwriting. The block capitals she'd watched him make her entire childhood, the same letters that labeled every tool in the bay, and every folder in the cabinet, and the envelope that had carried her name inside a wall for a decade. HOME. She set the pen down beside the glasses and the crossword. 3 objects on a counter that had held 10,000 cups of coffee and 40 years of conversation, and a quiet man's entire philosophy about what it meant to be alive in a place and useful to the people in it. She walked to the breaker panel by the back door. Earl had wired it himself, and every switch was labeled in his handwriting. She found the one marked sign and flipped it. Through the front window, she watched the glow come on. The hand-painted letters above the door faded and cracked lit from behind for the first time since Earl died. Macklin Gas and Service. Not bright, not new, but visible. A name and a light on a dark road in the mountains, which was all it had ever needed to be. Jessie came around the corner of the building and looked up at it. Looks good. Ruth stood in the doorway. The air smelled like coffee and pine and the first edge of autumn moving through the valley. She could hear the creek behind the station running over rocks the way it had run for centuries, patient, constant, going somewhere without rushing to get there. The stars were coming out. The mountains were settling into their outlines against the sky. And the sign was glowing the way a porch light glows when someone leaves it on, not because they're expecting anyone in particular, but because they believe someone might come and they want that person to know the door is open. She was 58 years old. She had a gas station on a road most people had forgotten, a mechanic who was learning to trust the world again. A father's legacy written in a leather journal, and a crossword puzzle that was finally, after 12 years, complete. She climbed the stairs to the apartment that smelled like motor oil and strong coffee and home. She lay down and listened to the mountain go quiet, and felt the particular kind of peace that comes not from having everything, but from knowing exactly what matters. She was 58, and she was just getting started. I'd love to know what's the thing in your life that looked worthless on paper, but turned out to be worth everything. Tell me in the comments, and if this story reminded you of someone who gave without keeping score, share it with them. They probably won't expect it. That's the point.